You know it's this. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowing like sis. Did it perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look up better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of What If Deku Meets Owlhouse. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Deathly Jazz Hands 55 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Reality Check Summer Camp. A camp located in the wilds in Springfield, Connecticut. It was a privately owned summer camp, given a license by the government. The people who worked at the camp had been previously getting ready for a new batch of kids this summer, and everyone was excited. Events were being planned out, as were activities, most of which were already nearing completion. At least, that was what had been happening. All work ceased immediately when a black limo sporting the logo of the Connecticut government pulled up. Nobody knew what was going on. All they knew was that a group of men in business suits walked out, and made their way to the office of the camp counselor. 20 minutes had passed since their arrival, and most of the staff had no idea what was going on in there. The truth of the matter was that a deal was being hashed out. A deal that would change the fates of everyone at that camp. A deal that would make or break the state. A deal that would potentially have generation-defining consequences. What do you mean you're commandeering the camp? On what grounds? A man with tan skin, black slicked-back hair, and the beginnings of a mustache on his upper lip exclaimed, eyebrows knit in a furious rage as his eyes narrowed, staring down the person sitting in front of him. The man, the camp counselor for Reality Check Summer Camp, wore an open-face brown button-up vest with the camp symbol in badge form on the left breast pocket, revealing a purple long-sleeve shirt underneath. A pair of black khaki shorts covered his waist and stopped at his knees, alongside a pair of white knee-high socks and black Timberland hiking boots. Sitting across from him was another man dressed in a two-piece black business suit and a bright red tie, with a white shirt peeking out from underneath the suit. In one hand, the man held onto a lighter whilst he puffed a cigar, leaning into his chair with one leg crossed over the other. Meanwhile, his free hand was stroking his beard, as a toothy, predatory smile gleamed just behind it. His piercing blue eyes shot metaphorical daggers into the other man's soul, who tried his damnedest to not look intimidated. Next to the man, on either side of him, were two members of the FBI, signified by their badges on their breast pockets. They too were dressed in black business suits and red ties with wiretap devices attached to their ears, sunglasses obscuring their eyes. All three of the men looked about ready to pounce at any given moment. Come now, counselor. I'll give you however much money you want in return for this. Think of it. You could give your family whatever it is they want. Just name the price, and I'll pay for it out of my pocket. Just try to be realistic, yeah, the man said, as the two FBI agents bristled as if waiting for orders to attack the counselor. Unfortunately for the man across the table, the counselor was not interested. He would stand his ground, if not for himself, then those who he had promised that their children would return home safe and sound. I don't care what you offer me. I will not hand over those children or this camp to you. Forget it. The man across the table frowned, as if disappointed. He took the cigar out of his mouth, before tapping it once, allowing the ash to fall to the ground. He sat up straight, tilting his head down ever so slightly, his eyes hardening like steel, glaring directly at the counselor. With all due respect, Counselor Johnson, this is for the safety of the people of Connecticut. I'm sure you understand, don't you? You wouldn't want any accidents happening and have it blamed on you, right? For all we know, those children could be Chinese super soldiers here to kill the innocent children of America. You wouldn't want that, would you? The man in the business suit asked as Johnson rocketed up from his chair, slamming his hands onto the desk with enough force to shake it. For a second, one of the FBI agents went to lunge toward Johnson, only stopped by the man in the suit, raising his hand, as if to tell them that it was all right. The FBI agent reeled back, getting back into posture with both of his arms crossed in front of his chest. Maybe it would be best for you to not do that again. I don't know if I can hold him back after this. It was a small taunt, but a taunt nonetheless. It made the counselor bristle with rage. His blood boiled with fury. To think that this man, that he represented the people of Connecticut. It was a complete and total shame. He had always hated the governor for political reasons. But now he had a personal reason to hate him. With all due respect, Governor, that's a load of bullshit. You know that I know that they are born and bred American children. It says as much on their BRTH certificates. We do background checks, so we get to see that type of thing. And besides, that doesn't give you the right to walk in here and say that you're going to do something without my knowledge. You didn't talk to me about it. I run this camp. No one else, and I for one am not stupid enough to fall for that kind of nonsense. What do you take me for, RETD? Johnson spat as the governor frowned, sighing. You know, counselor, you're right. I apologize. I shouldn't have worded it that way, the governor said, his frown turning into a scowl. I don't need to talk to you about it. This is an order. As he spoke, he snapped his fingers as one of the men beside him threw down a folder in front of Johnson, who faltered for a moment. The folder was labeled Top Secret in bright bold, red letters. Underneath it was a title. Project, Protect America, underneath it in cursive writing. Johnson stared at the folder, before looking back at the group of men in front of him, a bead of sweat trickling down the side of his face as he swallowed back a lump of fear. What is this? Johnson asked as the governor smirked. He crossed his arms, nodding his head once as if to give him a silent command to look at it. He was apprehensive at first, knowing that it was a top-secret document. Why, did you give me this? Go on, open it. You should at least know what the plan is. But know this, if you speak a single word out to anyone, you and your family will find themselves missing and unable to be found. As the governor said that, Johnson paled, recoiling in the process. The governor stood up from his chair and walked around the table to right behind him, draping an arm over his shoulder. Why you? You wouldn't dare. Johnson muttered as the governor chuckled. On the contrary. I very much would. If it meant that national security was protected, I'd do anything in my power to ensure that our country was safe. Including sacrificing some random schmucks who don't matter in the grand scheme of things. What was your child's name again? Masha or something? It would be a shame if something bad happened to her, wouldn't it? What about your wife? Leslie. I can only imagine how they'd feel if... All right. Johnson snapped, glaring at the governor as he smirked, pulling away as he walked back over to his seat, sitting down with his hands clasped together. Reluctantly, Johnson opened the top-secret document, taking in a deep breath, and reading. As he read, his expression twisted from anger to downright horror. Word after word, page after page, it only got more and more cruel until it turned into what amounted to a death mill. All under the perverted guise of protecting the God-fearing people of America from demons possessing the bodies of children. The contents of the document were nothing more than the ravings of an utter lunatic. What this document was suggesting. It was utterly barbaric, and no better than what happened back in the Second World War. Johnson looked back at the governor and stared, appalled. You can't be serious. And the government is sponsoring this act of terrorism? On its own people? Johnson muttered as the governor smirked. That's the best part. As far as they're aware, I'm doing my duties as a governor. They don't know what I'm doing, and these two, the governor said, pointing to the 2 FBI agents beside him, "They're under my payroll. Besides, all you need to know is that I'm sparing your daughter from it, per the agreement I'd have you sign. So, you personally have no stakes in it. Everyone else, on the other hand, not so much." All Johnson could do was stare at the governor with abject horror. The worst part was that there was nothing he could do. What was he, a lowly camp counselor, going to do? All he could do was shut up and agree. Pretend as if he had never seen that folder, and continue his life knowing that what he was about to do would put him on par with a Nazi soldier. What the governor was planning to do, would make Benito Mussolini spit on him. It would cause Stalin to puke, and Hitler to blush. And he was going to agree to it. The counselor let out a shaky breath, closing his eyes as he relaxed his shoulders. At least Masha will be safe. The counselor thought, before opening his eyes and glaring at the governor. Fine. You can take the superpowered kids. Just, please, keep up your end of the promise. I'm glad we could come to an agreement, Johnson, the governor said, a wide smile on his face as he outstretched his hand for a handshake. Reluctantly, Johnson took it, shaking his hand, a wave of disgust washing over him. The two let go of one another, and as they did, Johnson sat back down. The closest FBI agent picked up the document and slipped it back into his suit, leaving the desk empty before a piece of paper took its place. Johnson recognized the piece of paper. It was a legal document saying that he would be handing over the camp to the governor of Connecticut. 10 years ago, when he first opened this camp, the previous governor tried to do the same thing, though with the intention to make it a statewide thing, and a means of punishment for unruly students. Not turning it into a death camp to torture children. Johnson never saw his camp as a punishment. He saw it as a place for those who were a bit slow to learn things through interactive experiments, and group activities, and to build bonds with other people. That was the goal of Reality Check Summer Camp. A fun getaway with education mixed in. While the marketing made it seem like a disciplinary camp, it really wasn't. It was kind of ironic. The people who signed their kids up for RCSC wanted to instill normality into their unruly child, but that wasn't the point. It was to have fun. He also made it a habit to report the parents to CPS just in case something bad was going on, because this camp also worked as a front to protect children. But now it was going to be used to do the opposite of that. If he signed this piece of paper, he would be doing the very thing that he hated. He would be endangering children. But, if he didn't, his daughter would be put in danger. Masha would be hurt, or worse, and he couldn't bear that. Maybe he was being selfish. No, scratch that. He was being selfish. But, he'd rather be selfish than have a dead daughter. And so, with a heavy amount of reluctance, Johnson signed the piece of paper, the smile on the governor's face increasing twofold. "Thank you, Johnson Sumwoo, for your cooperation. You've made this country proud," the governor said, reaching to take the piece of paper. But as he did, Johnson grabbed his wrist and forced him to stare him in the eye. "You're a sick, depraved, disgusting, maggot-filled wretch of a man. As God as my witness, and as Jesus as my Lord, I pray that one day, you get what you deserve. The only afterlife available for you, Governor, is the 8th ring of hell, where all the fraudsters and deceivers go. You promised to protect the people of Connecticut, and now you're openly vying for their deaths. Go to hell," Johnson hissed, spitting in the man's face, directly on his cheek, before letting go of his wrist. The governor took a step back, staring at Johnson, before slowly reaching into his suit pocket, and pulling out a napkin, wiping the loogie off of his cheek. The two men stared each other down, a bitter anger between the two. After a long moment of silence, the governor turned to leave with his men, and as the door to the office closed, Johnson slumped in his seat. He had done it. He signed away the camp he had built for 20 years to an evil man, all so that his daughter could live another day. He doubted the governor would keep his word, but if he did, then that was great. But that didn't change the fact that he had doomed the lives of so many others. Johnson closed his eyes, the guilt building up in his chest as he tried not to sob. He was a monster. A horrible, no good, rotten monster. No better than the man who had just walked out of the door. And while there was a way out of this mess, he refused to take it. It was far too cowardly, and it would throw away what he had just done. So, instead, he clasped his hands together, sucked in a deep breath, and prayed. For that was all he could do. Oh, Lord Jesus, hear my prayer. I am a fool. An absolute, unforgivable fool. I've doomed the lives of 33 children, all so that my own daughter could live another day. Forgive me, for I have sinned. I am a murderer. Fact number 1 about Luz: she hated long car rides because they made her sleepy. It was something that she had picked up from her father. He often tended to sleep in the passenger seat when going on long car rides. The same went with his father and his sister. She, naturally, being his daughter, picked up that trait too. It was annoying. Especially when someone asks you to keep an eye open and ears peeled for when a stop is made. She had promised Julia that she wouldn't fall asleep to keep an eye open for a pit stop, and to wake her up when they got there. At first, about an hour into the drive, that was a fairly easy task. She kept herself busy by opening her suitcase and reading The Good Witch Azura. Fact number 2 about Luz: she loved The Good Witch Azura. It was one of, if not her favorite book. Oh, sure, she'd read it well over a dozen times, to the point where she could remember the plot off by heart, but that never stopped her enjoyment of it. She also wasn't blind to the faults of the book either. From the bland protagonist to the trope-filled sidekick and the generic plot structure. It was quite literally a dictionary definition of a book of tropes. But even then, it was still her favorite. Why? Because it was the last ever gift she received from her dad. So she treasured it for all it was worth and some more. If anything were to happen to that book, she'd probably lose whatever remaining sanity she had left. That aside, for an hour, she read that book. Eventually, she put it down, growing bored from reading it as her mind dotted about with several ideas, but without the ability to act them out without making herself look like a fool. So, instead, she hummed songs quietly to herself for another hour, growing tired around the halfway mark. 2 hours into the drive, she could see some of the other would-be campers doze off. Even the camp attendant had dozed off, leaving only herself and a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy in the seat next to her. He had short, ear-length hair, and was dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt with 2 green stripes going through the center. He also wore a pair of long, off-white pants with zippers at the knees, and a pair of green and black lace-up Adidas shoes. He was sort of lanky, and he had slightly hairy arms. It was kind of weird, but considering she didn't know his age, she assumed he was at least 2 or maybe 3 years older than her. The boy glanced over at Luz, eyebrow raised. "SHT, are you the only one awake?" he asked as Luz shrugged. "Probably, I guess most people went to sleep." "How long have you been here?" she asked in return as the boy crossed his arms, leaning back into his bus seat. "Got here at 4:30 back in Bridgeport with a few other kids, about 6, I think. Then we went to Milford to pick up another 2, which was like, what? 8 minutes? Then it took us about an hour from there to Litchfield to pick up 10 other kids. Then we stopped in Kent to pick up another 8 kids half an hour later. Finally, before we stopped in Gravesfield, another half an hour away we picked up 12 other kids in Washington Depot. So, add another 2 hours from leaving Gravesfield to wherever the F we are now. I'd say 4 hours. As the boy explained the route the bus took to get to Gravesfield, which was seemingly the last stop before the camp itself, Luz realized that all of the kids that were going to this camp were from Connecticut. It was a little strange, knowing that everyone was from Connecticut, but it did make her a little bit more comfortable. The boy looked at her, a neutral expression on his face. "So, random change of topic, but, you got a favorite band?" Oh. Luz said, smiling, yeah, I really like Nate Wants to Battle. He's not a band, but he does a bunch of nerdcore music. My favorite of his is the finale. As she said that, the boy across from her chuckled to himself. It caused Luz to blush with embarrassment. At least, until he said something that caught her off guard. A fellow Nate fan, huh? That's rare. The finale's alright. Never been huge on the Five Nights at Freddy's stuff. But personally, his cover of The Takeover, The Break's Over, is my personal favorite. As the boy said that, Luz was almost elated to find someone with at least somewhat of a similar musical taste to her. That was one of the many things that Luz found herself getting bullied over. Her taste in music. She was never a huge fan of established bands. They all sounded the same to her. Aside from Owl City and the Beatles, she never really cared for established artists. Indie artists? That was where it was at. Of course, when others found out that she was a massive nerdcore fan, it made her a laughingstock. Apparently, it wasn't cool to support small artists. Not that she cared. It was her taste in music and no one else's. Even if it did get her cornered by a few of the other girls in class and beat up. Though, she was pretty sure it was for standing up for someone else, rather than that. But, honestly, she didn't really care. That one was a strong one to explain to her mother. Especially the black eye. She was slowly starting to not buy the whole, falling down the stairs, excuse. Name's Kennedy, and you? Kennedy asked as Luz smiled. Luz. Nice to meet you, Kennedy. Same here, Kennedy said, a small smirk taking up his visage. So, what else do you like? And so, for the next little while, the two talked about things they liked. Such as books, movies, and even anime. It turned out that Kennedy was a huge fan of Madoka Magica and Naruto. Luz wasn't all for the latter, but the former was a good one, even if she thought its depiction of witches was kind of creepy. Seriously, it was something straight out of a drag trip. Luz, on the other hand, was a massive One Piece nerd. She found Luffy to be extremely relatable, going against the establishment and rebelling against the rules and standards. She was currently on the Enies Lobby arc. Kennedy was ahead of her, being at Thriller Bark. He didn't spoil anything for her, only saying that Thriller Bark sucked in his opinion. Aside from that, they chatted a storm about movies they liked and what other types of music they liked. They had talked for so long, that a whole 2 more hours passed, when the bus suddenly stopped. Luz looked over her shoulder and saw that they were at a Shell gas station. Putting a hand on Julia's shoulder, she shook her lightly, causing her to grumble, sitting up slowly as she clutched her forehead. Ugh. Huh. Julia grumbled, squinting as she shielded her eyes from the sunlight coming in through the window. A yawn escaped her lips as she blinked a handful of times, before looking out to the window. Oh, we're at the station. Thanks, Luz. No problem, Julia, Luz said, hopping out of her seat as several of the other campers got up and out of the bus. Kennedy did the same, stretching as he stood up. Luz looked over in his direction and had to stop herself from staring due to just how tall he was. She could have already guessed that he was tall due to how lanky he looked. But this? This was ridiculous. Kennedy easily stood 2 heads higher than Luz, who was a flat 5-foot-tall person, 5'1" if she was on her tippy toes. Meaning Kennedy was probably, like, 6 feet 5 inches, at least. The woman from earlier stood up from the seat she had been seated in, rubbing at her eyes as she stood at the front of the aisle, yawning as she did. All right. While the bus refuels, you all have 15 minutes to get something from the convenience store. Remember what I said before. If you don't have any money, ask the person you're sitting next to get you something. But just remember, by the end of summer, you should pay them back. Don't be the type of person to take advantage of their generosity, and with that, the woman sat back down, as everyone filtered off of the bus. Do you two need any money? Julia asked Luz and Kennedy, as Kennedy shook his head. Nah. I had the foresight to bring some. What about you, Luz? Luz rubbed the back of her neck, embarrassed. Sorry. I didn't think this would happen. She muttered as Julia smiled, patting her shoulder with a good-natured smile. It's all right, Julia said, before reaching over to her suitcase, pulling out a wallet, opening it, and pulling out a $20 bill. Inside the wallet, there were well over $100 in there. Luz knew that Julia was loaded with cash, but holy CRP, that was a lot. Geez, don't your parents spoil you rotten. You got nearly over $100 in there. Kennedy quipped as Julia frowned, closing her wallet before putting it back in her suitcase, zipping it up and turning back to Kennedy. No, actually. I earned that money myself from doing odd jobs around Gravesfield. My parents had nothing to do with that. We don't get along. Julia stated as Kennedy hummed, nodding. Yeah, I get that. I never got to know my mom, and my dad was a wife-beater. So I think we're in the same department there, Jules, Kennedy said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Jules? Julia asked, blinking as Kennedy shrugged. Yeah. You don't like it? Kennedy said as Julia shook her head, a soft smile taking up her face. No, I don't mind it. I just wasn't expecting that. Most people call me Julia or Julie. Jules is a new one, Julia said as Kennedy snorted, resting his hands behind his head. He watched as everyone slowly trickled out of the bus, and so, after a quick stretch, he stood up, gesturing for Luz and Julia to follow him. We don't have a lot of time, so let's get going. Don't want to miss the possible only chance we have to get something to eat before we reach camp. And that's exactly what they did. They exited the bus and entered the convenience store, aware of the time limit over their heads. Julia found herself buying a snack-size bag of all-dressed Lay's potato chips and a bottle of Pepsi. She also bought a survival knife for camp, namely because she didn't have one in her suitcase. As for Kennedy, he bought himself a bag of flaming hot Cheetos. He was planning on saving the money that he had while he was at camp in case there were vending machines. Nothing else was of interest to him. He was trying to keep his weight low, only getting the Cheetos because his stomach was growling, and if he didn't eat something soon, he'd go stir-crazy. Luz wound up getting herself a Coca-Cola and Pepsi-flavored Slurpee and a bag of mini eggs. She also made a pit stop for the bathroom before they left. All in all, it wasn't much, it was better than only going off of a half bowl of cereal. Over by the front of the store, Julia and Kennedy were standing outside, laughing about something. When they spotted Luz, Kennedy waved her over, a huge smile on his face. Yo, Luz, hear this. Apparently, when Julia was younger she thought a bear cub was an overgrown puppy. Wah! Luz exclaimed as Julia flushed with embarrassment. Give me a break. I was 6 and my parents kept me sheltered inside our home for most of my life. That was the first time I even heard of a bear, Julia said, pouting as Kennedy held back another bout of laughter. Luz had to admit, that was funny. Julia then looked over to Luz and smirked. What about you, Luz? Have any embarrassing stories? Luz faltered, looking at the floor. A few came to mind, but the most recent one, the snake incident, was still fresh in her mind. The others were too personal, and she didn't want to share them. Especially the one about the fake love letter she had gotten, which resulted in her being drenched in a bucket of expired milk. Well, I brought a bunch of live snakes into my classroom for my final project for English 9. It was, the reason why my mama signed me up for this camp, Luz said, absently looking to the side as Kennedy snickered. DMN, Luz, that's rough. Also, mama. Is that like a Spanish thing? Kennedy asked as Luz nodded. Yeah, it is. What, you think it's weird? Luz replied, raising an eyebrow as Kennedy shrugged. Nah. Just never heard someone call their mother mama unironically before above the age of 4, that's all, he quipped before shoving his hand into his bag of Cheetos, popping a couple in his mouth. You know, Kennedy began through chews, swallowing afterward, once this camp nonsense is over, maybe we can all friend each other on Discord. I kinda like this dynamic we got going here. I don't have many other friends back home, and I wouldn't mind to keep in contact. Discord? Julia questioned as Kennedy stared at her incredulously. Oh nah, you don't know about Discord either? Kennedy asked, raising an eyebrow. What, did your parents lock you in your room or something? The silence in response to that question was deafening. Kennedy looked at the floor, rocking front to back on his heels. Luz looked at Julia with a gleam of sympathy in her eyes. Just what kind of parents would do that kind of thing? That was just cruel. All right everyone, back on the bus. The woman attendant called out, drawing everyone's attention. Without a word to each other, the group of 3 walked back onto the bus. As they walked past, the attendant had a garbage can stationed next to her. With each would-be camper walking past, a few things of garbage were added. One would-be camper, in particular, a tall, muscular teen, with muddy brown skin, broad shoulders, and the makings of a goatee stood in front of the attendant. He was wearing nothing but a gray tank top and black sweatpants, along with dark brown lace-up boots, his arms crossed, and a contemplative look on his face. Hey, question, the teen asked as the woman raised an eyebrow. Yes, Stanley. If I roll down one of the windows, can I smoke on the bus? All this stress is killing me, and I can't relax, Stanley said as the woman sighed. She looked almost disappointed. She looked over to the bus driver, who nodded, as Stanley smiled. Thanks. You're a lifesaver. Why would someone smoke? It's just a pathway to having cancer in the future, Julia said as Kennedy sighed. Stan's always been like that. We grew up in an orphanage. The place sucked, and so he picked up a smoking habit to deal with the stress, Kennedy said as Luz looked at Kennedy with a raised eyebrow. Didn't you say your dad was a wife-beater? How could you have grown up in an orphanage? Luz asked as Kennedy gave her a deadpan stare. The keyword was Luz. My dad beat my mom to death and was arrested and hauled off to jail. Hence, I now live in an orphanage, Kennedy said as Luz flinched. Sorry. No need to apologize, Kennedy said, waving it off as if it was nothing. Sides, it was a valid question, and with that, the group of 3 reboarded the bus, heading to their seats at the back. It was only then that Luz realized that Stanley had been the one whom Kennedy was sitting next to. The window rolled down as the tall, muscular man hadn't draped out the window, smoke blowing in the wind outside of it. Luz was kind of upset with herself that she had failed to notice him. But, then again, given the fact that he was now sitting upright and not asleep, he was far easier to spot now. Stanley looked over to Luz and Julia, his expression neutral. Those new friends of yours, Ken? Stanley asked as Kennedy nodded. Yup. Stan, meet Luz and Julia, Kennedy introduced as Stanley nodded in greeting. Luz waved awkwardly as Julia did the same, only politely, as if she had been trained to do it in that specific way. Luz yawned, a wave of drowsiness washing over her. She could hardly keep her eyes open. Not that it was her fault, she could hardly sleep well last night. Especially after that argument. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to take a nap. Julia, can we trade spots? I don't mind, Julia said, standing up as the 2 traded places. Stretching briefly, Luz curled up into a ball and rested her head against the window, closing her eyes. Don't wake me unless it's important. Luz grumbled, as she did, very quickly, she found herself in a deep sleep. At least, that was the case, until her eyes shot open, sucking in a deep breath as if she had just been pulled out from underwater. Her eyes from left to right, and instead of finding herself on the bus, she found herself in the same dark, void-like location she had woken up in 2 nights prior. Nothing had changed about the place. The interior was still the same. The same. Two throne-like chairs greeted her, empty as they had been the last time she was here. A cold chill washed through the void-like room as Luz shrunk in on herself, a feeling of nothing but despair taking root. Where was she? How did she get here? She knew this was some kind of lucid dream, but why now? Lucid dreams, from what she knew, were not reoccurring. So why now was she having this one again? She swallowed the building fear in her throat, as, suddenly, without warning, several blue lights began to glow around the roof of the void-like room, each providing an eerie glow. She flinched in place, looking from left to right, her eyes dilating in fear as she faced the pair of thrones in front of her. What's going on? Ruth no Sita. A deep, baritone voice reverberated throughout the void-like room as Luz looked over her shoulder, into the darkness behind her. What she saw was nothing but two pits of crimson red staring at her from a distance. A shadowy form, with no body, no face, just two crimson, demonic red eyes. And it was speaking to her in, from what she could understand, Japanese. Not ready yet. Connection not completed. Suddenly, a gust of powerful wind blew over Luz. She braced herself, putting one foot in front of the other and shielding her face with her arms. With each passing second, the gusts of wind grew stronger and heavier, the lights on the walls slowly going out. Behind her, a white, door-like gate appeared, and just as Luz was being lifted from the ground by the wind, the voice had one last thing to say, even if she could not understand it. The next time you return to the world of shadows and past memories, we will have much to discuss. Wake up, Luz. Your destiny awaits you. And then, she was flung out of the void-like dream. She shot up in her seat, her breathing heavy and shakily with sweat trickling down the side of her face, her eyes dilated in her fear. Her heart beat against her chest rhythmically, as if she had just finished running a marathon racing against a pack of feral wolves. Slowly, she began to calm down, swallowing down the lump in her throat as she blinked, adrenaline leaving her system as she looked around the bus. It was empty, and it was completely dark out. The bus driver was oddly slack, and so was the attendant. Fear once again began to claw up her spine as she slowly stood up, grabbing her suitcase. Had she been left behind? That wasn't right. Why was she left behind? Where was everyone? Hello. Luz said, her voice meek and timid. So many questions raced through her mind. What was that just now? That freaky dream? That voice, and why was it speaking to her in a language she couldn't understand? And now this? Where was everyone? What had happened? Why hadn't anyone woken her up? Slowly, taking one step at a time, Luz crept down the aisle of the bus, and when she made it to the front and turned to look at the attendant, she was slumped over the seat, with a bullet wound right between her eyes, which stared vacantly at the ceiling lifelessly. Luz screamed, stumbling backward into the driver, who, as soon as she bumped into him, also had a bullet between his eyes, and riddling his face and upper torso. Blood droplets from his wounds splattered on Luz's face and clothing, as she shoved his body off of her. She stumbled forward, grabbed her suitcase and ran down the stairs of the bus entrance. When she got out there, she was met with 7 dead bodies, all riddled with bullet holes. All of the bodies belonged to the children aboard who did not have any superpowers. Luz wanted to puke, her body shivering with fear as she swallowed down the vomit. What the hell happened here? What was going on? Where was? A sharp pain reverberated throughout her body, as a loud, smacking sound sounded off behind her. She didn't even realize what had happened. All she felt was something hitting her in the back of the head, and after that, she hit the grassy floor, and the last thing she remembered seeing was the black boot and the beginnings of camel-colored pants. We found the last one. Project Protect America is officially underway. And then, there was silence. Camila sat at home, having just gotten off shift at the vet clinic. Today had been an absolute nightmare, filled with nothing but screaming patients, panicking over their pets and their health, to constant confused phone calls from other previous pet owners who were trying to figure out what to do now that their child had dog ears. What the devil was she supposed to do about a child with dog ears? She was a vet, not a doctor. Oh, sure, she had basic medical training, but that was all. The rest of her training was directed toward four-legged or winged animals. Not people. And those treatments weren't exactly transferable to people. No matter their newfound animalistic mutation. Oh well, at least she was getting paid overtime due to staying 2 hours later than normal. Sitting on the couch, she relaxed into the back cushion, closing her eyes as she took a deep breath, and exhaled. She could really go for a glass of wine right about now. Unfortunately, she was bone dry from last night. She was pretty sure she had gotten blackout drunk, having not remembered what happened. Whatever it was that happened, though, seemed to have been bad. She had woken up to there being a red stain on the rear wall and shattered glass. Coupled with how Luz had acted this morning, being distant and nervous around her. It made Camila question what had happened. She had a feeling that whatever she had done was horrible. She wasn't blind to the facts that had been presented to her. A shattered glass with a red stain on the wall. Either Luz took her wine glass from her and threw it away, or she threw the wine glass at Luz. And if it was the latter rather than the former, then that would have explained why she was so distant. Unfortunately, she had no way of confirming what had happened with Luz. She had already left for reality check summer camp, and wouldn't have cell service there for her to call her. So, she'd just have to wait till the end of summer vacation. Camila would like to think that she was a good mother. She put a roof over her daughter's head, put food on the table, and tried her best to be supportive. Oh, sure, they had their roadblocks and their arguments, but it was never anything detrimental. And yet, now she was starting to have doubts. Doubts that wasn't the mother that she thought herself to be. In truth, it had been a struggle ever since Manny died. Working late into the night, being shouted at by pet owners for not being able to read their thoughts about what they wanted done to their cat, dog or bird. Stressing over whether or not she was giving the correct medicine to the right animal, and in that dosage that they needed. Sometimes she slept at the vet clinic, not coming home till the next day, and coming home to a mess as if a tornado tore through the place. Luz was a messy person, that much was obvious. She blamed it on her hyperactivity and her inability to sit down and chill out for a few hours. She always had to be doing something, and that caused Camila even more stress. It was manageable with Manny around. But after his tragic passing in a horrendous car crash, whilst he was taking their daughter to daycare for that afternoon, things had only gotten harder. And to make matters even worse, Luz was showing no signs of maturing, or at least, in the way that most people did. Some people thought that was a good thing. Camila, on the other hand, didn't. More than anything in the world, Camila wanted an extra pair of hands to help around the house. To make a living and income so that they didn't have to go paycheck to paycheck for half the year. Oh, sure, there was the option of going on dates, but she personally wasn't interested, and she wasn't going to force herself into a loveless relationship for money purposes only. She was desperate for money, but not that desperate. So, with all of the stress she experienced to give her more than enough gray hair to last her till she got to her 60s, she found it acceptable that she could reward herself with a drink or two. But, if that drinking was causing Luz's and her relationship to go by the wayside, then maybe she should try and go sober again. For good. The problem was that, when you are addicted to something, you get heavily irritated and become quick to anger without the vice you're addicted to. It's a cruel cycle. Even crueler when it comes to vices like alcohol. The worst part about this whole ordeal was that she never remembered anything from when she got drunk. Not even an inkling or a sense of déjà vu. Apparently, that was called Jekyll and Hyde syndrome. Not quite dissociative identity disorder, nor was it borderline personality disorder, but it was related. It didn't excuse whatever her behavior was when she got into that state. Whatever she did, as it was obviously something bad, was unacceptable. Camila sighed, sitting upright as she took off her glasses and wiped her face, dragging her hand across it as she yawned. Forget making dinner, she was close to passing out. Just as she was about to get up to head to her bedroom, a buzzing sensation vibrated in her left pocket. She didn't need to check what it was, because she already knew it was her phone ringing. Her only question was who could be calling her at 10:45 in the evening. Taking her phone out of her pocket, she looked at the screen and raised an eyebrow. She recognized the number but was still confused as to why it was calling her. It was the St. Peter's Liturgical Church. Why would they be calling her now? She hadn't been there in over a month and a half. Maybe they were calling to check up on her. That was entirely possible, but still, it did strike her as a little odd. Deciding that it wasn't worth her time to question it, answering the phone, Camila put it up to her ear and spoke. Hello. Camila Nocita speaking. What can I do for you? Oh, good heavens, I'm glad I got into contact with you, Camila, an elderly, but familiar voice exited the phone speaker, the voice having belonged to Pastor Domenico. Once again, Camila was left confused. Why on earth would he be calling her now? He was usually in bed by this time. Then again, the church was closed on Wednesdays, so it made sense if he decided to stay up later than usual. Still, though, it was weird. The last time Pastor Domenico called her directly, it was regarding the funeral service for Manny. And that was well over a decade ago. So what could have possessed him to call her like this? Pastor. Good evening. You sound upset. Is something the matter? Camila asked as Pastor Domenico cleared his throat. Pray tell, have you watched the news at all today? Domenico asked as Camila's eyebrow raised even further, confusion painting her expression. Camila, in general, hardly watched the news in the first place. To her, it was all over-dramatized slop for people who had nothing going on in their lives to watch. The only time she watched the news was during election season, and that was so she stayed up to date with the polls. Still, as Domenico spoke, there was a hint of fear and nervousness in his voice. Why would he be afraid? And how did the news tie into any of this? No I haven't. Why? Turn on the TV and go to CNN. It's important, Domenico instructed, and out of the need to cure whatever was building up inside her, Camila did just that. She grabbed the TV remote that was next to her and flipped on the TV, which was a 27-inch flat-screen TV. It cost her around about $685 to buy, and that was because it was secondhand. Once the TV was on, she flipped through the channels until she got to CNN. And what was on made her stomach drop. Thank you, Stephen. Returning after the weather, we still do not know the full story behind the bus attack in Springfield, Connecticut. The bus belonged to the privately owned Reality Check summer camp, and for unknown reasons, it was attacked at 9:30 p.m. The crime was reported at 10 p.m. when a scream came from the area of the attack, and since then, the only information police have been willing to give us is that there were 9 bodies found at the scene of the crime, 2 adults, 7 children, 4 female and 5 male. All of the children are currently unidentified. According to currently collected evidence, 40 children were reported to have been on the bus, 33 of which are a part of the new aberrants popping up worldwide. Police suspect this to be a kidnapping by a terrorist organization, and are currently asking for help investigating. The FBI has been notified and will be joining the investigation as soon as possible. As soon as we have more information, you can count on us at CNN to deliver it to you immediately. Camila stared at her TV, her hand covering her mouth as her eyes widened to the size of saucers. This couldn't be happening. Luz was on that bus. Her Querida Hija was on that bus, and she was just finding out now that it was attacked. If Pastor Domenico hadn't called, she would have never found out, because she would have never turned on the TV. Camila, are you still there? Domenico's voice broke through her thoughts as Camila snapped back to reality. Why yes. Oh, Dios mío. I need to call. Don't bother, Camila. I already have. The police still haven't identified the bodies. But, there is a silver lining. I gave them Luz's description, and none of the bodies matched it. So while she isn't dead, that still means that your daughter has most likely been kidnapped by whatever group did this. I'm sorry. And just like that, Camila's heart sank further. While Luz was alive, thank God, her fate was still up in the air. What did those people, whoever they were, want with her daughter? She wouldn't know, and likely would never know until the situation was solved. And by then, who knew what would have happened to her daughter? For all she knew, she could be dead by that time. And to know that their last interaction was one that potentially resulted in a fight. It made her well up inside. Camila, try and get some rest. It's already late and I know that work must have been hellish for you. I'll let you know if I hear about anything else, alright? Pastor Domenico said as Camila hummed in acknowledgement, hanging up the phone moments later as it fell to the couch with a thud. All Camila could do was sit on her couch, hands in her face as she sobbed. Her daughter was in danger, and there was nothing she could do. And the worst part? She had sent her there. She had put her on that bus, and now because of that, because she put Luz on that bus, she may or may not be dead due to her actions. Camila Noceda was a horrible mother. A throbbing headache was the first thing that Luz was greeted to when her eyes peeled open, the rays of the sun blinding her in the process. She felt something soft, yet slightly uncomfortable underneath her, like a stiff mattress or something akin to that. Her hand lazily hung over her face as she blocked out the sun, squinting all the while. Luz groaned. Slowly sitting up as she clutched the back of her head. What was going on? Where was she? All she remembered from last night was the bus. Luz exclaimed, shooting up from whatever she was lying on, instantly regretting it as she groaned once more, her headache worsening as she did. A cacophony of confused voices echoed throughout wherever they were being held up, as Luz surveyed the area. From what she could tell, they seemed to be in a tent. The tent walls were dark green, with plastic windows on the roof. Metal beams kept the tent from falling on them, planted firmly in the ground, and lined against the walls were metal-framed beds with white sheets and white mattresses. There were no pillows, just the mattress and sheet. And also, as she noticed, everyone still had their shoes on. They slept with their shoes on, even her. That was just barbaric. Clearly whoever kidnapped them, because that was obviously what had happened, there was no two ways about it, were monsters. Although, that was apparent, given their situation. Luz. Julia's voice cut through her observation as she turned to look in the direction of where she was, that being right next to her. Are you alright? Could be better. Luz answered, chuckling awkwardly as she scanned the room once more. Everyone on the bus who hadn't been killed were here, all of them having strings attached to their foreheads, confirming her theory that those who had been shot and killed were those without powers. That only led to a single, solitary question forming in her mind. Where are we? Everyone, front and center. A bellowing voice echoed out from the entrance of the tent, catching everyone's attention. The voice belonged to a man dressed in a camo, army-styled uniform. He had peach-colored skin, and on the left side of his army coat, there was a name tag. Sergeant Dempsey. Sergeant Dempsey had a shaved head, piercing brown eyes, and a look that screamed of revulsion. His hands were behind his back, standing in proper military form. Proud and tall, without slouching even an inch. He overlooked the room, eyes narrowed, before grunting. All right, maggots. You have 10 minutes to figure yourselves out. And then, I expect to see you out of this tent. If you're not, I'll come back in here and drag you kicking and screaming. Understood? Confused and scared silence was all he was met with, which seemed to make him angry. I said. Do you filthy wastes of skin understand? That got everyone to respond, as a cacophony of yes sirs echoed out from the tent. Dempsey nodded, before turning around and walking out of the tent. Something told Luz that this wasn't reality check summer camp. If anything, this seemed more like boot camp. And considering what it was that she saw back on the bus. Alright, I think it's fairly obvious, but something up is going on, a rough-sounding voice echoed from the back of the tent. Luz looked in that direction and saw Stanley, who sat on his bed with one leg pressed up against his chest, his right arm draped over it. Thanks for pointing out the obvious, another voice spoke up, but this one was one Luz didn't recognize. It was feminine, and the person to whom it belonged was a shoulder-length black-haired girl with cat ears sticking out of the top of her head, along with whiskers coming out from her cheeks. A single pointed tooth poked out from underneath her upper lip as a frown sat on her face. She looked a little on the bulkier side, and she was dressed in a black, knee-high dress with cat-themed leggings, along with a pair of high-top boots. One of her arms had a sleeve that started at the elbow and stopped at the wrist, X's sitting on the interior of the sleeve, and on her fingers were what appeared to be long, 3-inch claws that replaced her nails. She sat on her bed in the butterfly position, one hand pressed against the mattress while her other rested against her leg. So, what are we going to do? Do as they say. We're the ones with powers here, right? We could easily beat the CRP out of them. A boy with bright orange hair, fiery red eyes, and pale skin with freckles exclaimed, one of his hands bursting to light with fire as a smirk took up his visage. Yeah, great idea. Then we can all get shot by high-power assault rifles together. Go us. A sarcastic, German-accented voice spoke from the front of the tent, as Luz once again found herself looking in that direction. The voice belonged to a pale blonde-haired woman who looked to be around 18 years old with emerald green eyes and freckles. She was dressed in a black LTHR vest with spikes on the shoulders, and a sleeveless dark blue tube top that topped just below the chest, revealing her midriff and exposing her belly button, alongside a pair of jean shorts with torn edges, and a black beanie that sat lopsided atop her head. A black spiked choker fitted around her neck and matched with her spiked bracelets. To complete the punk outfit, she wore fishnet stockings with spiked-toed boots that had belt straps on the sides. Hey! It's not a bad idea. Besides, fire trumps guns 100 times out of 100. Scared of a couple of loud noises, Nazi? The redhead asked, a snarky tone to his voice as. BL oder amerikanischer Hund. You want to die, don't you? Also, just because I am German does not make me a Nazi, du mieses Schwein, the punk woman spat, glaring at the redhead. It was only when someone cleared their voice loud enough to get everyone's attention that the two stopped glaring at one another, and for everyone to turn to face the person in question, said person being Kennedy. Ladies, you're both ugly, so let's not fight and analyze the situation we're in, yeah? Kennedy said, earning a glare from the punk woman, not that Kennedy seemed to care. Right now, we're hostages of some militant group. What or who they are, we don't know, nor do we know what they want, so instead of sitting here and plotting to attack them right away, let's go see what they want. Besides, for all we know, they could have our families held hostage. For as much as Luz hated that idea, Kennedy was right. They had zero power in this situation, and while it was tempting to do what the redhead said, the smarter choice would be to scope out the situation. See what could be done, and if it was nothing, then follow what the kidnappers wanted until an advantageous position showed itself. What? She had played her fair share of strategy games. She knew what was she talking about. Alright, so then, why don't we get to it? Luz said, springing off of the mattress she was on, followed by everyone else doing the same. As they began to walk out, Luz noticed that Julia had decided to stick close to her, because she was standing next to her, and was holding her hand. Luz wanted to say something about it, but given how much Julia was shivering and seemingly terrified, she decided not to object. Once they stepped out of the tent, they were met with a wide, open forest surrounding them from all sides. Trees that reached up to touch the sky blocked their view of anything except the sky and nature. Everything, except for the small battalion of soldiers standing in a semicircle behind one singular man. A man whom Luz recognized from seeing him on billboards and TV. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a beard that went down to the base of his neck. He had a predator smile plastered on his face, and his blue eyes gleamed with anticipation. He was dressed in a black suit with a white shirt and red tie underneath, accompanied by a pair of black slip-on shoes. On his upper right lapel was an American flag pin, and he held himself in high regard, as not even for a second did he slouch. "Is that the governor?" Stanley said, blinking in shock as the man looked over to Stanley, his smile widening. "Why yes, hello young man, you be correct. I am your dutifully elected governor, Governor Roger Maxwell. And I would like to thank you all for coming to Reality Check Summer Camp," Maxwell said as Luz raised a skeptical eyebrow. "This was Reality Check Summer Camp? I call bullshit. This ain't no summer camp. You kidnapped us." A bulky-looking Hawaiian teen spat, who looked eerily similar to Stanley. He had muddy brown skin, jet black hair, and dark brown eyes. The main difference between Stanley and this guy was that he was wearing an orange and white striped, short-sleeved, V-collar shirt and a pair of dark blue jeans and brown Timberlands. Aside from that, they looked like long-lost brothers. In response to the accusations, Maxwell chuckled lightheartedly, rocking on his heels and toes a few times before clearing his throat and staring at the Hawaiian teen. "Well, you're not wrong. There's no point trying to lie. But, legally speaking, I didn't. See, I recently purchased Reality Check Summer Camp, and since you all willingly signed up for it, I did not kidnap you." "What about the people you killed on that bus?" Luz blurted out, glaring at Maxwell, who turned to face her. She had expected to see an angered glare. Instead, she got a smug grin and a confident stare. And that wasn't to mention the cool, calm and collected stance he took. "He's a psychopath. Oh my God, he's insane. Unfortunate casualties that didn't need to happen, but did anyway. Besides, I didn't want anyone to know where you lot were taken. This is kind of top secret, and the government does this kind of thing regularly. Once again, I'm legally in the right." Maxwell then turned away from Luz and stared everyone down. "Now, time to explain to you all what's going to happen. For the next 2.5 months, you all are going to be put into 3 groups of 11, and the last team alive wins $150 million divided among themselves, followed by signing an NDA to not speak of what happened here. Okay?" While most of the people were focused on the large chunk of change that Maxwell offered for the winning team, Luz included because holy SHT, that was a lot of money. Julia was the one who spoke up, alerting everyone to a minor, very important detail that changed the scenario from a strange but interesting game to something far, far more nefarious. "What do you mean by the last team alive?" Julia asked as the large-scale discussion halted immediately after those words left Julia's mouth. "Oh. Well, isn't obvious? This is a life-or-death game. Welcome to reality, kiddos. Any questions?" Silence. No one dared to exhale even the faintest bit louder than a whisper. Whatever conversations were being had before Maxwell answered Julia's question had completely halted, in favor of staring at Maxwell and the militia behind him. It was only now that Luz had gotten the chance to see what they had been carrying, and it wasn't limited to rifles. They had heavy machine guns, shotguns, and even miniguns. They were prepared should any one of them step out of line. And the worst part? They knew that they had them cornered. Sure, they all had superpowers of some variety. But bullets would still pierce flesh. Still strike arteries. Still do everlasting damage. Those weapons were used to render whatever they fired at into tiny little bloody puddles. They weren't aimed at them just yet. But she felt as if at any moment, should any of them breathe incorrectly, they would be aiming down their sights faster than she could say, wait. What was worse was the look in their eyes. They were bloodthirsty. Ready and waiting. Maxwell stood behind them, arms at his sides, expression twisted into one of false glee. The weight of his words hung heavily over them. There was often a saying used to justify actions like these, the saying going along the lines of, this is a kill or be killed world, so it's best to be the one who kills first, otherwise, you might be the one killed. But she didn't think it would apply to this situation. At least, currently. Maybe there was a way out of this. What? A French-accented voice spoke out, as Luz glanced in the voice's direction. A black-haired boy who looked no older than 12 stood more toward the center of the group, skin an ashen pale, most likely due to the fear he was feeling. He had a single streak of white going through the right half of his hair, and he had heterochromia, with one of his eyes being blue, and the other silver. He was dressed in a black shirt with a missing right sleeve, and a pair of dark brown shorts with black socks and shoes. He had a burn scar on his wrist, and she noticed that he had a hole in his wrist, most likely a side effect of his power, whatever it might have been. What's the matter? Can't handle the truth? Maxwell asked as the boy flinched. And no, it's just, why? Why? Maxwell replied, tilting his head slightly to the left as if puzzled. He smirked, before tilting his head upward ever so slightly, holding his head high as if he were some kind of judge. Well, I could lie and say that I want you all turned into super soldiers for the benefit of the country. But, considering that's what Texas is doing, quite literally might I add, I wanted to do something else. Except, I didn't know where to begin. Until one person approached me and offered me a deal I just couldn't refuse. As Maxwell spoke, the tension in the air seemed to spike. Luz was the only one who noticed it, her shoulders raising as she felt herself begin to shake. She couldn't tell if it was out of fear, or anger, or both. But the feeling Maxwell's words gave off was nothing but sinister. That was obvious, especially considering the context behind them, but still. This person offered me as much money as I needed to make this project a reality. We only had a week to do it, but it worked out in the end, didn't it? I can't go saying my benefactor's name, but they are a consistent backer of mine. But, instead of making it obvious and boring and painfully clear that all I want is for you kids to die, because, I'm an open book. There's no reason to lie about it. I decided to make it a game. And, don't worry, I'm a man of my word. If there are any survivors by the end of it, you'll get the money I promised. This isn't a game, this is just murder with extra steps. How can this lunatic think this is a game? Luz thought, frowning. She was getting Major Danganronpa vibes off of this man. The more he talked, the more he sounded like Junko. Except, even Junko was more reasonable than this nutcase. But why? Kennedy exclaimed, glaring daggers at Maxwell, his hands clenched into fists as he sneered. What did we ever do to deserve this? We're just kids. It's not like we kicked your dog or some SHT. Kennedy spat, taking a step forward. As he did, the sound of a gun firing echoed throughout the silent clearing in the forest, causing Kennedy to stop dead in his tracks. In the dirt, an inch away from where Kennedy stood, there was a bullet hole. Kennedy paled, eyes wide as Maxwell frowned, turning to look behind him, his back facing them. Which one of you idiots fired your gun? As Maxwell asked that, one of the soldiers from the back raised their hand. Maxwell sighed, before digging something out of his pocket, that something. Being a gun, a revolver, to be precise. Maxwell pulled back the hammer on the gun, and without so much as giving the soldier a chance to say anything, he raised the gun toward him, and fired, shooting a bullet between the man's eyes, watching as he fell to the ground in a heap, his gun falling to the floor as well. The other soldiers straightened out, holding their heads high and keeping their guns lowered. Maxwell pocketed the gun, the butt of it sticking out from his pocket as he glowered. Now, I don't think I should have to say that we're trying to get these kids to not panic any more than they probably are. What's rule number 1 about hunting an animal? You, Private Stevenson. Never try and make them feel threatened, sir. You're goddamn right. So, let's make this a lesson, folks. No firing at the kiddos unless they try to escape, K. Maxwell said to the soldiers, who all barked out, "Yes sirs," in tandem with one another. Maxwell then turned to face the would-be campers turned hostages, a slightly apologetic look on his face. "My apologies for that, son. He didn't know his place. Anyways, what were you going to do? Attack me? Tackle me? Punch me? Don't suppose you have a plan, do you?" Kennedy gulped, taking a step back as Maxwell smirked. "Smart boy. Now then, any other questions before we begin the main event?" Maxwell asked, scanning the crowd. All Luz could think about was just what kind of mess she had gotten herself into. She was stuck in a rock and a strong place, and that strong place was backed up against a grinder. Their lives were, essentially, handed to a psychopath with what appeared to be the attitude of a child. Either that, or he was having way too much fun. What was worse was that this whole thing could have been avoided if she had just stayed home. Ignored the wishes of her mother, and tried to lie to her about the bus not showing up when she got home from work. Though, then again, that probably wouldn't have ended well either. She most likely would get angry at Luz, and they'd have a repeat of last night, just, hopefully without the whole glass-throwing thing. Assuming she'd get drunk. If not, then hey, maybe they could have a civilized conversation. But that was all just a bunch of what-ifs, and it was unfortunately not the reality of things. The reality of things was that she was stuck in what amounted to a game of life and death, surrounded by a bunch of complete strangers, with no real way to escape without the threat of being gunned down. And all of this was happening on the 3rd day of summer vacation. Just what kind of screwed-up situation did she find herself in? What was this, a book? A TV show? A movie? Where are the cameras, the director, or the showrunner? Because she sure heck wasn't seeing them. Unfortunately, there was nothing of the sort. This was the reality of the situation. This was real. She could truly, honestly, die here. All it would take was one wrong move. One wrong word. It didn't matter. She would die horribly, so for her sake, she had to keep her mouth shut. Because she knew the moment she opened her mouth, she would say something to piss Maxwell off. Then came everyone else. Her fellows in this situation, and the threat they presented to her now. They were all superpowered children, much like her, and they knew the stakes, too. They knew that they were in a kill-or-be-killed situation. And chances were, they were eyeing up each other, her included. It was only then that she realized, truly, that she was a dud. They were being moved into a situation that banked on survival of the fittest, and she had yet to figure out her powers, what they did, and how they functioned. While some people's powers were hidden or unable to be figured out, some of them, like the girl with the cat ears, were obvious. What was she going to do if she ever got into a fight with these people? Maybe she could try and talk them down. Pull a Naruto and befriend them. That was honestly her best shot until she figured out what her palm holes did. She was still working on the theory of her being able to copy people's powers. But, for all she knew, she could be wrong. What she did know, was that, compared to everyone else, she was nothing. She had nothing to her name, no ability to fight, and the unique thing she had was her ability to see strings on people's faces that made her hands spark red. What kind of lame power was that? Everyone else in this place has stronger, better powers than myself, even Julia does. If I'm caught off guard by someone who has murder on their mind. A wave of dread washed over her as a horrifying idea welled its way through her head, finally fully setting in. Oh, Dios mío. I could die here. The dread on her face was visible to anyone who looked at her. She felt a squeezing sensation on her right hand, and when she turned to look where it was coming from, she saw Julia. She had completely forgotten that Julia was next to her, still holding her hand, still just as scared as she was, and was now staring at her with concern in her eyes. It was sweet, and she was glad she had someone like Julia right about now. Despite having just met, it was clear that Julia was, on some level, an empathetic person. She liked that. Aside from her mother and late father, and her cousin Riley on some levels and Mr. Jones, Julia was the only person she had known who had been nice to her. "Are you all right?" Julia whispered as Luz sucked back a shaky breath, nodding. Julia looked unconvinced but didn't bother to say anything. She just smiled and nodded, letting go of Luz's hand, who swallowed a lump down her throat. Her nerves were all over the place right now, and try as strong as she couldn't get them under control. After a few more moments of silence, Maxwell nodded to himself, before speaking up. "All right, to the main event, it is. Now, pay attention, because I won't explain this again. The game that'll be had all summer long, or until one team is left standing, is called Civil War. The rules are simple. All 33 of you will be split up into teams of 11, and of that group of 11, one of you will be pronounced the leader. It is that leader's job to, lead the team to victory. Everyone following me so far, nod your head yes or shake your head no." Everyone nodded in unison. "Great. Now, some ground rules. I will condone murder and torture on game grounds. I mean, that's the whole point. But I don't want any of you older kids to get frisky, you hear? We're here for killing, not making love, yeah. Don't matter if there was consent or not involved. I don't want to see it, because I have cameras set up everywhere. And I do mean everywhere. And where I don't have cameras, I have drones. Which leads me to my next point. No breaking the equipment on purpose. If it's an obvious accident, that's cool, SHT happens. Especially so with superpowers. Now, these are the 3 most important rules. Everyone gets a base. Each of your teams will be led by one of 3 individuals to go to your corresponding bases. For Team Alpha Squadron, when you're all picked out, you'll be led by Sergeant Dempsey. You all met him, he's the guy that woke your sorry asses up, Maxwell said, pointing to the man in question, who was standing beside what Luz assumed to be the flag of that group, which was black with 3 large blue knives going across it, along with the initials A.S in the upper right corner. Team Foxtrot will be led out to their base by Sergeant Mathers. He's the big black guy with the buzz cut and beard. As Maxwell said that, a man with dark ebony skin and bulging with muscle, dressed in the same camo uniform as every other soldier, stood next to a bright red flag with a white kitsune mask logo on it, surrounded by a sakura flower. He grunted, nodding at them as he did. And finally, last but not least, Team Heaven's Devils will be led out to their base by Sergeant Holden. He's the big guy with the eye patch and bushy mustache, Maxwell concluded as he pointed toward Sergeant Holden. He was shorter than Dempsey or Mathers, but Holden was still very much an intimidating individual. He was like a mix between Dempsey and Mathers. He wasn't scrawny or bulky like the other 2. He fit in a comfortable in-between. He had tan skin either because it was a tan, or because he was born like that, and he had a single brown eye, narrowed with distaste at them as if he found their existence to be offensive. And, much like the others, he wore the same uniform, though he had a sun hat on his head to block out, the sun. Holden stood next to a flag that had the decal of a pair of red horns accompanying a halo, with one angelic white wing and a bat-like black wing on both sides of the decal. It was probably the most basic of designed flags that Luz had seen out of the 3, but the name was kind of badass. Focus, Luz. Death game, remember. Don't give this guy any praise, he's a monster. Luz thought to herself, turning her attention back to Maxwell. The man put his hands behind his back, clearing his throat as he did before continuing. Now then, as for the second very important thing. At the end of every week, until only one team remains, there will be an airdrop containing food, water, and clothing. It will land precisely in the center of the forest, and it will be your guy's job to try and capture it for your base. Only one airdrop will be available, so be quick about it. Don't be alarmed, as we have also given you enough rations to last the whole summer, provided you use them correctly, of course. The airdrops are meant to give you a safety buffer. After all, while the goal is to kill people, survival is kind of necessary. Also, it would be boring just watching a bunch of teenagers starve to death, right? The question was obviously rhetorical, but still, the way he said it rubbed Luz the wrong way. What was he implying here? Were people going to be watching this? Who? Where? How? Was that why he had set up cameras? What kind of sick freaks would watch such a thing? Then again, considering just how depraved some people could be, and also the existence of murder mystery games, and novels, yeah, that checked out. Of course, he could also be implying that it would be boring for himself, considering it was obvious that he was observing the whole thing from start to finish. Which got Luz wondering. If he was here, then who was in charge of Connecticut while he was away doing this? Was taxpayer money being poured into this death project? She'd have to assume so. This whole thing reeked of illegality on so many levels. The only thing he probably wasn't able to be charged for would be kidnapping, since he technically was right. Luz didn't know law stuff very well, so she just assumed he was right. And finally, and this is the most important one. If there is not just a single team left standing by the time the summer is out, I'll press a neat red button in my observatory far, far away from the site of this little camp, and have it carpet bombed. And again, before you ask, I have all of these guys on my payroll, funded by your tax dollars. Isn't that amazing? And just like that, things went from bad, to even worse. How was this guy even allowed to run for office as the governor? There had to be a background check or something for that, right? That, and there was no way he was just allowed to do that. That sounded super illegal. So, to sum up what they were being told, not only were they being forced to kill one another, but if not enough people were killed, he was just going to bomb them. She guessed that once the media found out, he would paint this as them carpet bombing the kidnappers and frame it as a shame that everyone died in the bombing. You can't be serious. Why, I very much am, Maxwell said, interrupting the German girl from before, whose face had turned completely pale after what it was that Maxwell had said. This was a nightmare scenario, and the only winner here was Maxwell. He would get what he wanted, regardless of the outcome. Now then, on to the leaders. We'll start in reverse order, so, the Heaven's Devils are up. Holden, who is the leader of Heaven's Devils? Holden looked at them, before looking down at a clipboard he had pulled out from underneath his armpit. He looked back at them again, a smirk taking up his visage before a New Yorker accent came out of his mouth. Kennedy Jenkins. Kennedy froze, before shaking his head. He looked back at Luz and Julia, before smiling at them. Let's hope we're on the same team, yeah. Kennedy said, before walking over to his flag, standing in front of it as per instructed by Holden, who pointed at the spot in front of the flag. All right, and Foxtrot. Tell me Mathers, who gonna lead it? Maxwell asked as Mathers wordlessly pointed at Amelia, who gulped, walking over to the flag without saying a word, standing in front of it, just like Kennedy. That left the Alpha Squadron. Maxwell smirked, before clearing his throat. All right, and Dempsey, who's going to lead the Alpha Squadron? Dempsey smirked, cocking his head from left to right, cracking his knuckles as he did. Well, if it were up to me, I'd say no one, since none of you spineless F are worth the SPRM you were made out of. But, since I'm being forced to choose. Dempsey said, a cocksure tone to his voice, he tilted his head up, as if to analyze everyone. Well, I gotta say, this is a bit harder than I thought. Those two F already had their choice when they looked at the files. I decided to wait till I got to see you all, and personally, the type of qualities I pick in a leader are the kind who don't show any visible fear in a dire situation. For a majority of you failed that right off the bat when I showed up. But there was one person. Only one. Who didn't show that fear. Who stared at me, and even had the gall to glare at me. That person has ball of steel. Metaphorically speaking, obviously. And for that, they got my respect, for what that's worth anyway. And then, Dempsey's eyes landed on Luz, his smirk increasing tenfold. And that person is you. Congratulations, Luz Nocida. You get the shitty job of leading a bunch of pathetic whelps. Good luck. You better win this SHT, or I swear to God, I'll haunt ya. And as soon as Dempsey said that, he looked over to Maxwell, and straight out glared at him, confusing Maxwell. What's got your panties in a twist? Max, buddy, I respect you mate. Through and through I did. We agreed on a lot. When you proposed this idea to me in this little group here, I thought you were joking. But then you go out and do it and throw me into this mess. What kind of friend does that? So, you know what, F you. F you, and F your little twisted game. If you hadn't jammed communications, I would have alerted the rest of the military to your SHT. I'll see ya in hell, and as Dempsey said that, he drew his gun, a Beretta 92X, aimed it at Maxwell, and just as he was about to pull the trigger, a bullet shot through his skull, courtesy of Mathers. Damned rat, Mathers spat as Maxwell blinked, staring at Dempsey's corpse. With a disappointed look on his face. He snapped his fingers, as another soldier took his place, while another one dragged Dempsey's corpse away. All Luz could do was stare with wide, horrified eyes. In the last few minutes, 2 people were already killed, and excluding those back at the bus, that was far too many for her to stomach. But, because she was running on empty, she couldn't exactly throw up, though she did want to. This was awful. If Maxwell was so willing to kill his own people, be it by himself or through others, then that meant that he really did have no qualms with killing them or watching them die. A naive part of her hoped that maybe this was all just a prank, and Maxwell had a horrible sense of humor. But, she couldn't deny it anymore. Once again, she was faced with the reality of the situation that this really was happening and no one was coming to save them. Well, that was a waste of time and effort. Oh well, not that I care, Maxwell said, turning to face Luz. Well, what are you waiting for, get over there, kid. Luz didn't know what to say, or to do. What happened in that moment was far too bizarre for her to even ask about. It looked like Dempsey was trying to spark something in them, but whatever it was, it didn't work. But, those last words that Dempsey said specifically to her. You better win this SHT, or I swear to God, I'll haunt you. Maybe it was because she was a bit on the naive side but she wanted to honor that. And she'd do it without killing a single person. Flat out, she would not cave to this madman's so-called game. She refused it. But, for the time being, she'd play her role. So, she walked over to the flag, closing her eyes, before standing in front of it, glancing over at Kennedy. Kennedy stared back at her, an upset look on his face. It was clear that he didn't want this to happen. She guessed they were enemies now. But, that didn't feel right. None of this felt right. Everything since the second she woke up here felt wrong, and now, more than ever, that sensation was ringing in the back of her head. This was not what was supposed to happen. Something was missing. There had to be. Maybe this was some kind of dream. Maybe the first time, when she pinched herself, she didn't do it strong enough. So, she did it again, and yet again, she felt that same sharp feeling when they pinched themselves. Alright. Well, that concludes the leaders. As for the rest of the teams, choose whoever you want to go to. Just remember that only 10 people can join that specific team. We don't want to make things unfair, do we? You all got a minute to get this done, so, go. As soon as those words left Maxwell's mouth, the others filtered their way to find their respective teams. The first person that she saw come over to her was Julia, who stood next to her, glancing over at Kennedy, who nodded in understanding. The next person who joined their group was that Stanley person from the bus, and so too did that goth-looking cat girl. They both stood close to one another, both talking in hushed voices, which meant that they must have known who each other was. One of the stranger people who joined Luz's team was the boy with the holes in his wrists. The French-sounding kid. Another person who joined was the other bulky Hawaiian kid. Next to him was a girl with neck-length black hair, who seemed to have two-toned skin in splotches, like spots of black and white littering her skin, along with bright yellow eyes. She was also by far the most mature-looking person out of all of them, minus the adults and Amelia, so she was probably 18, maybe 19. She was dressed in a brown sweater shirt with the sleeve on the right having been cut short, bandages traveling up the rest of the arm and hand, even wrapping the individual fingers. She wore a pair of high-waisted jean shorts and fishnet stockings with heeled boots. Around her neck was what appeared to be a yin-yang necklace, and over her shoulders was a cloak of sorts, a deep viridian with a circle pin keeping it in place. Why would she be wearing a cloak? For fashion. Probably, but it was a little weird. Then again, Luz knew she had worn weirder herself. The less she talked about the embarrassing Shrek shirt, the better. Honestly, she had no idea what possessed her mother to buy it, but it was kind of funny. The next person to approach Luz's group was a golden blonde-haired boy with hair that was styled in curls, dressed in a pink, wide-collared shirt and dark blue pants. He had paler-than-average skin and greenish-blue eyes. Along with that, he had a ladybug-themed bracelet on his wrist and a pair of slip-on red shoes. He also had a chain in his pocket that circled up to the lip of them, clipping onto it with a clamp-style clip. The final three weren't much to write home about. They walked to them in a group, meaning they were a tight-knit group. From left to right, there was a small girl who was maybe 13 years old with shoulder-length strawberry red hair, pink eyes, and a permanent blush on her cheeks. She was a little on the bigger side of things, and she was dressed in a black hoodie and red pants with black hiking boots. Then, there was a slightly taller boy with an average-ish appearance. The only thing that made Luz say that he wasn't completely average was the streak of green in his hair. Aside from that, he had brown hair, brown eyes, and peach-colored skin. He was also wearing a sleeveless pullover hoodie, the hood being down, with a pair of light brown cargo shorts and black sandals. Of note, he also had a tattoo on his arm, signifying that either his parents allowed him to get a tattoo, or he was older and just turned out to be a bit on the small side. The tattoo in question was of the vampire mask from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, a show that Luz wasn't exactly too fond of due to the intense amount of gore. Finally, the person on the right was another boy, though he was the tallest there. If the strawberry-haired girl and the average-ish guy were 4'5" and 5 feet flat, then he was 5 feet 7 inches, hitting the standard height most boys were supposed to be at 16 years old. He was dressed in a standard white t-shirt with short sleeves, and the starting of a mustache on his upper lip. He had a nose ring piercing, along with a few horn piercings in his eyebrow. He also had a pride flag pin on the shoulder front-facing part of his shoulder. He also wore a pair of snakeskin slacks, held up by a pair of black LTHR belts, along with a pair of cowboy boots. A pair of suspenders was also attached to the lip of the pants, and he had a bow tie on the collar of his shirt. It was like he had walked out from the Wild West, and it was more than a little jarring. Luz looked over to the other groups, though she could see no one she recognized from the bus in the other teams. Although, the boy with orange hair was on Kennedy's team, and he looked more than a little eager to get things rolling. It made Luz wonder just how many other of her fellow kidnap victims were of the same mindset as him. Kennedy, for his part, didn't seem the least bit happy about his attitude but didn't show it. She could tell, though. It all came from how his eyes gleamed with annoyance staring at the redhead. As for Amelia's team, she looked content with the people she had around her. Luz looked over her team and felt fairly confident. Now all she had to do was find a way to not have this whole thing end in a BLD bath. Alright. This is looking good. Now, one more thing. For the next 24 hours, there will be a time of peace. Meaning no bloodshed can occur during this time, Maxwell said, clasping his hands together, before smirking. Holden, Mathers, and Private Daniels will lead you now to your bases, respectively. Get going. And so, without another word, they were led off to where they needed to be, into the brush of the forest led by their captors to where they would be for the rest of the summer break. As they hiked through the woods, no words were exchanged with anyone. The sounds of the wilds echoed around them, such as the chirping of birds, the rustling of bushes, and the rays of the sun peeking out from the leaves covering the sky. All the while, Luz was left to her thoughts, frowning as she did. She couldn't find any silver lining here. Not only were they kidnapped, but they were on a time limit, too. She glanced down at her hands and shivered. Maybe she could just let the other two teams kill themselves. But, then that meant that Kennedy had to die, and Kennedy was a friend, so that couldn't happen. This sucks, what am I doing to do? Luz thought, clasping her forehead as she mindlessly followed Private Daniels and everyone else through the forest. She glanced over at Julia, who had a stoic expression on her face, her hands clasped one over the other as she walked forward. Everyone else was still in the groups they had made for themselves, seemingly watching each other's backs. Luz felt out of the loop. But then again, she was used to that. As Luz continued to walk, she stared blankly ahead, stuffing her hands into her shorts pockets. She had to admit, that probably the only good thing about this was that they were in the wilderness, so they were away from constant air pollution. Not to mention the sound of the birds chirping was nice. It helped her. Watch out for the root. You'll trip. Out of nowhere, a sudden, baritone voice invaded her thoughts, causing her head to ache. Clasping her head in pain, she hissed, squinting her eyes as she stopped dead in her tracks. The group stopped, turning to look at her, including Private Daniels, not that he seemed to care, more of it was out of reflex. Luz looked up, then at the ground, and saw the root that the voice had mentioned. She looked back at everyone else and smiled faintly, laughing awkwardly to herself. Sorry about that, sudden migraine. Whatever, Private Daniels spat, before continuing forward. Julia walked over to Luz's side and helped her up. She glared at the back of Private Daniels' head, before turning back to face Luz. Are you sure you're alright? I'm fine, Julie, promise, Luz said, smiling earnestly as Julia stared at her for a second, determining whether or not she was lying or not. If she had made a decision, Luz couldn't tell, as she backed away, smiling, before following the rest of the group, who had begun to leave them behind. Luz glanced back at the root, then scratched the side of her head, following after everyone. That voice. It was the same one from her dream, though this time it was speaking English and not Japanese. What is going on today? Why is my life becoming so DMN weird all of a sudden? Luz thought, shaking her head with disbelief and annoyance. This was starting to get a little too much, even for her. It took another hour before they were brought to their base, and when they got there, all Luz could do was stare up at it with a mix of amazement, and also disgust, especially considering what it took to get her there. What she was being forced to do, and why she was being forced to do it. The walls were made of logs, spiked at the top with two towers at the entrance. A giant bridge-like gate sat between them and the interior, with flags planted into the walls, said flags belonging to them. Private Daniels marched them inside the base, and as they entered, Luz was able to get an idea of just how large their base was. The walls of the base were at least 30 feet wide and 30 feet high, at least, that was what Luz thought anyway. There was a lot of open space, mostly empty, but still, there was stuff to do. Several wooden cabins sat in the center in a semicircle, about 3 to exact. In the center of the cabins, there was a campfire, unlit with supplies next to it to light a fire. There were also cooking materials like pots and pans hanging from a makeshift rack. Out from the center of the base, there were two pathways, one going left and the other going right. On the left, there was a path leading to what appeared to be a bathroom set up with two outhouses, both connected to a septic tank that was covered by a wooden building. Luz knew that because of the sign on the building of a tank and the common graphic for the toxic smell above it. To the right there was what appeared to be what Luz could only describe as a storage shed, and next to it was another shed, though it had a skull insignia on top of it. That made Luz think that was where the dead were supposed to be stored. Not that she would allow anyone to die. It was a leader's job to ensure that their people survived. And Luz would do that. She would not fail them, regardless of what happened. Even if it cost her her life. That bitter thought made Luz feel gross. She just hoped it wouldn't get to that point. But, considering that redhead and his eagerness, there was a distinct chance that not everyone was of the same mind as her. And that could be very, very bad. Don't think about that, Luz chided to herself, frowning. Have faith in others. Everything will be alright, for the most part. No one is going to die. Not on your watch. As Luz thought that, she looked over to Private Daniels, who was beginning to leave, shoving people out of his way. However, as he walked past the girl with the black and white spotted skin, and as he shoved her, she stomped on the grassy terrain below her feet. As soon as she did that, a shadow appeared underneath Private Daniels' feet. The shadow was circular, and as soon as that happened, he fell through the shadow, only stopping halfway as the shadow snapped shut, cutting him in half as blood splashed on the floor surrounding him. People flinched, Luz included, as the gun clattered to the floor. The black and white-skinned woman picked up the gun as one of the spots on her skin disappeared. Idiot, she spat, before putting the gun into one of her spots, kind of like a miniature pocket in her skin. Luz stared at her with wide eyes, shock evident within them as the girl shrugged. What's got you bugged out? You just killed him, Luz said, staring at her. In response, the teen scratched the back of her neck, an uncaring gleam in her eyes. Well, he had it coming. He's one of the people who kidnapped us. Besides, that prick Maxwell said no bloodshed between us. That, and do you really think he cares about those under his employ? She said as Luz went to say something, but stopped, closing her mouth before sighing. She supposed that the girl was right. Still, it just didn't sit right. It also unnerved Luz how willing the girl was to kill him. Then again, she had no idea what kind of life the girl before her had before this. For all she knew, she was some kind of assassin or something like that. Not that it was possible for that to be the case. Right? So, leader, what's the plan now? Stanley spoke up, as Julia was over by the drawbridge, using her vines to pull the rope to bring it to a close. She made it look effortless, though she guessed that made sense. It wasn't like she was lifting it herself using her arms. Despite her frail appearance, she seemed stronger than she let on. Luz let out a shaky breath, her nerves unwinding and her hands shaking. A bout of nervousness washed over her in such a way that it made it strong to think. The last hour and a half had been filled with nothing but terror and turmoil. The last thing she wanted to do was come up with a plan. Plan? What plan? I don't have a plan. We just got here. And maybe we can leave her be for a minute. Give her a chance to, get her nerves in check. The strawberry-haired girl suggested as Stanley nodded. Yeah, makes sense. I'll go scope out the cabins. And with that, Stanley walked past Luz, but not before patting her on the shoulder, and whispering, "You got this, buddy," before walking away. Luz was inclined to disagree with him, but for her sake, she had to have this, so to speak. How about we do a get-to-know-each-other thing? Julia suggested, walking over to stand next to Luz, the drawbridge now being fully raised. Like, share our names? The boy with the green streak in his hair asked as Julia nodded. Precisely. We'll go from left to right, starting with me. Oh, and the boy who walked into the cabins is Stanley Richardson. He has a strength-based power. He told me as such on the bus, Julia said, before putting a hand above her chest. As for myself, I am Julia Scotsman Whitbane, and I can produce thorny vines from my fingertips. I call my power vines. Basic, but accurate. What about our leader? The goth-looking girl asked as Luz looked over at her, smiling faintly. Oh, I don't know, Luz said as the goth-looking girl raised an eyebrow, which prompted Luz to quickly follow up. And by that I mean I don't know what it does. I can see strings attached to people who have powers, and my, hand sparks red whenever I touch the string. But, I don't know much else, hee. As Luz finished frantically explaining what she knew about her power, and after the embarrassment of being called out faded away, the goth-looking girl nodded. Well, if you don't know, then you don't know. But try and find out soon, yeah. As for me, I'm Carla Tsunada. And, if it wasn't obvious, I'm part cat. I can also turn into a cat if I scratch myself with my claws. I'd demonstrate it, but it's kind of messy. I can either turn into a house cat or a panther and I act accordingly with no control over it, Carla explained as Luz's eyes sparkled with intrigue. That's so cool. Luz exclaimed, and in the blink of an eye, she was up in Carla's face who recoiled at the sudden action. Julia watched from a distance, giggling softly to herself at Luz's antics. It was almost relaxing to know that Luz could go from depressed and moppy to excited and happy in the blink of an eye. However, Julia did find it a bit strange. How could she do that? Especially knowing the situation. Or, maybe, she was forcing it. That was definitely a possibility. Julia blinked, and in the time it took for her to do that, Luz had been picked up by the back of her shirt by the Hawaiian boy, lifting her off the ground a few inches as she crossed her arms, pouting, with Carla giggling to herself. Geez, you've got quite a lot of energy in ya, the boy said, putting Luz down, who brushed herself off after landing. Sorry about that, Luz apologized to Carla, who waved it off. Nah, it's fine. You're cool. The large boy smirked as Luz turned to look over at him, an eyebrow raised. So, what about you? What's your deal? Me? Name's Ronnie Armstrong. I can enhance my base strength. Dunno by how much, but I think it's doubled, Ronnie said, flexing his arm as it bulged with muscle. You see this? Wasn't like that last week. It doubled my muscle mass, too. Freaky, yeah. Ronnie asked as Luz nodded, scratching the back of her neck. That was kind of weird. It sounded like super strength, but not really. So, you have super strength? Luz asked as Ronnie lowered his arm, shrugging. Yes and no. Pretty sure Cousin Thomas has that, and he's with that Kennedy guy. It sucks, but it happens, I guess. I just hope we can find a way to make sure this doesn't turn into a bloodbath. Ronnie said, frowning. Considering everything? I doubt it, the golden blonde-haired boy spoke up, getting Luz's attention. Name's Marconi. Marconi Giovanni. I can give life to anything I touch, but it takes a lot out of me. Makes me sleepy. As he said that, a butterfly, which Luz had just noticed was sitting on his finger, transformed into a dollar bill, before it then transformed into a flower, specifically a rose. I'm Jean-Pierre, the French-sounding teen, who was standing next to Marconi, spoke up next. He shifted uncomfortably where he stood, rubbing the back of his neck as a nervous look took up his visage. Bonjour. C'est un plaisir de vous rencontrer. Ha. Luz tilted her head to the side, confusion on her face as Jean sighed. Right, it's nice to meet you. Well. It would be, but considering the situation. Jean said as Luz looked away. Yeah, she felt the same way. It was kind of upsetting that she was getting this chance to meet all these people but in this crappy situation. I can sprout swords from my arm. Jean said, flexing his wrist as a sword blade ejected out from the top of his wrist. I can create them anywhere on my arm, but this is, easier. Judy, the girl with the black spots on her skin, spoke up. Jean faltered, earning a snort from her. You saw my power. I can control the dark spots on my skin and put them anywhere. They can act as storage or as weapons. I call it Spot. Like Spot from the comics or some SHT. Stanley called out from the cabins, who were walking out from the one in the center. He approached the group, a smirk on his face. Judy huffed, crossing her arms. She muttered something, which earned a snort from Stanley. Knew it. What about you, Stanley? What can you do? Julia asked. Stanley, for his part, looked over at Ronnie. You got a strength power, yeah? He asked as Ronnie nodded. Good, hit me square in the CHST. As he said that, he tapped himself in the center of his CHST. Ronnie raised an eyebrow, before glancing over at Luz. Honestly, she didn't know what to say. At first, she was a little concerned, especially considering that Ronnie didn't look too sure of himself. But, that confident look on Stanley's face. Come on, don't just stand there, do it. Ronnie glanced again at Luz, who stuck a thumbs up. Ronnie nodded, before turning to look at Stanley, clenching his hand into a fist. As soon as that happened, Ronnie's arm bulged, veins becoming more apparent as if he had just taken steroids. His eyes became bloodshot, and his teeth gnashed together. He charged toward Stanley, who stood with his arms wide open, a smirk on his face, not once losing confidence. When Ronnie struck, Luz thought that Stanley would go flying. She expected it to be something out of one of those anime fights. That Stanley would crash into the drawbridge and get knocked out. But, that wasn't what happened. The fist made contact with Stanley's CHST, the impact causing a massive burst of wind to blow through the air, blowing leaves off of nearby, low-to-the-ground trees. Bits of grass were torn up by the wind and flew against the wooden wall behind Stanley. Anyone around Stanley had shielded themselves from the wind, Luz included, who covered her face behind her arms. After a second of the wind blowing as strong as could be, it stopped, allowing Ronnie to look up at Stanley, removing his hand from his CHST, Stanley not even having a single speck of dust on his body after the fact. Luz lowered her arms, staring at the scene before her, mystified. While what she imagined before was cooler, what she witnessed was just like in those crazy action anime. That kind of awesome power was only something seen in fiction. And both Stanley and Ronnie displayed such feats in real life. Her inner nerd was screeching with excitement, and a large dopey smile had wormed onto her face. While it wasn't displaying the same amount of excitement in her head, it was still there, and it was showing that she still thought it was cool. Shock absorption, Stanley said, smirking. I can absorb a lot of force, nullifying the damage. Pretty cool, yeah. Stanley continued as he put his arms down to his sides, his right hand in his pocket and his left hanging around uselessly. I found out at the start of the week when I got hit by a car, and instead of me going flying, the car flipped over me. I would say that's unbelievable, but after seeing what we just saw. The pink-haired girl said, before glancing over at Luz. And I'm Arla. Arla Thatcher. I can heal people just by touching them. Though it makes me sleepy, and I can't heal myself. Arla introduced as Luz nodded. A healing power. Interesting. And also very helpful given the situation that they had found themselves in. I'll go next, the boy with the green streak in his hair said, crossing his arms as he smiled. The name's Johnny Marshall. As Johnny introduced himself, he picked up a stone, and as soon as he did, it began to vibrate. And I can vibrate things. And I'm his cousin. The boy with piercings said, wrapping his arm around Johnny's shoulder, transforming his other arm into, quite literally, a sword. It went from his slightly peachy, slightly tan skin color, to jet black steel. His fingers formed together to make the point of the blade itself gleaming in the sunlight. Name's Theodore. Theodore Jackson, nice to meet you all. Wish it was in better circumstances though. Well, if that's everyone, then I guess we can just, relax for a bit. Luz said, earning a nod from everyone. Everyone except Julia looked at her with a concerned look in her eyes. But why? Was it something that she said? As everyone broke off from one another, Julia approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. As she did, Luz yawned, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. Are you alright? You look like death warmed over, Julia asked as Luz shrugged, rubbing at her eyes. Where had this sudden exhaustion come from? Well, she hadn't exactly slept all that well, having been knocked out and all. Not to mention she had hiked a distance she wasn't used to walking. Maybe she could go for a nap. I'm just tired, that's all. I didn't sleep well for, well, obvious reasons. Being knocked out sucks. Luz replied, rubbing the back of her head, right where she had been hit with what had knocked her out, which now that she thought about it, was probably the butt of a gun. Then go lie down, Julia said, causing Luz to frown. But, that'll set a bad first impression. I don't want people to think I'm lazy. You're not, though. Besides, this will probably be the last day one of us will get a chance to relax without feeling like we're being watched. So go take some time for yourself. I can take charge of everyone while you're out. Besides, everyone in a leadership role has a second in command. I can be yours. Really? Luz said, as, only now, she realized that she had been tense since they walked through the drawbridge, her shoulders just now relaxing as Julia nodded. Why not? Think of it as you being King Arthur, and I'm Sir Geraint if you know what I'm referring to. Anyway, Julia continued as Luz scratched the back of her neck. The only King Arthur I'm familiar with is from 7 Deadly Sins. Ah, well, maybe I'm Meliodas and you're Ban. That implies you're a pervert and I'm into young-looking people. Julia giggled, shaking her head as Luz sheepishly smiled. Well, either way, you get what I mean, Julia retorted, crossing her arms. You need the rest, and I'm all energized. If anyone asks, I can just say that you were about to fall asleep standing up. Friends look out for other friends, right? Luz smiled, relaxing even more. If Julia was willing to take up that burden to let her sleep, she'd take it in stride. Besides, she was right. Friends were there for one another when they were needed. And right now, she needed a friend to help her out. Thank you, Julie, you're a lifesaver, Luz said, not realizing she had embraced her in a hug, which she didn't seem to mind, even hugging her back after a moment of shock. It was only when Julia hugged back that she realized that she may or may not have overstepped her boundaries, causing her to take a step back and start to apologize. My bad. I'm sorry if I offended you, It's alright, Luz. Seriously, calm down. Go rest. I'll wake you up when you're needed. Besides, I don't mind hugs from people I believe I can trust. You seem more than trustworthy, so you're okay, Julia said, a faint smile on her face as Luz sighed, her cheek still tinged pink with embarrassment. Alright, wake me up in an hour or two, adios. And with that, Luz walked over to the cabins. She entered the middle one, and upon entering, she was greeted with exactly what Stanley had described. 3 bunk beds on either side, with sloppily put-together beds, each with a single pillow and sheet to act as a blanket. There were no lights, just windows, and aside from suitcases lining the back of the wall, there were no decorations within the cabin. Honestly, it looked like a military barracks, which was more than a little disappointing. But, what was she to expect from a psychopath with no concern for human life? Luz walked over to the nearest bed, and sat down, before shifting to lay down on the thin, barely even usable pillow. A heaviness washed over her eyes, making it extremely difficult to keep them open. After just a few seconds, and with one final yawn, Luz drifted off into a deep, mirthless sleep. And then, as if zapped back to life, Luz's eyes reopened, her vision flooded with darkness, and the same place that she had been in before. The same carpet. The same throne. The same fireplace, all as she had last seen it. Except now, there was another person. And just by looking at him, Luz could tell that he was bad news. He sat on the left throne, dressed in a black business suit with a crimson-red tie hanging from the collar of a white dress shirt poking out from underneath the suit top. He even had a gray pocket square in the left pocket of his suit blazer. Pale skin, the same kind of pale a ghost would have, and crimson-red eyes were his most defining features. He wore a thin-lipped smile on his face, one hand stroking his chin as he hummed in thought. Short, white, ear-length hair sat atop his head, and he had a few freckles on his cheeks. There was one more thing about the man that caused Luz to be more than a little nervous. He was a very broad-looking man. She could tell, just by looking at him, that he was powerful. His gaze doubled that feeling as if his eyes were scanning her like a machine would, breaking her down into individual categories and judging her before even speaking a word to her. Alarm bells rang in the back of her head. This guy, whoever he was bad news. His stare, combined with his smile, and combined again with the way that he sat screamed evildoer. And the worst part? She felt as if she had met him before. As if she had known him. But, for the life of her, she couldn't recall anything about him. And then, in a voice that she recognized, the man finally spoke. Luz Nocita. A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. It's time that we've had a little chat. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Deathly Jazz Hands 55 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.